Thank you very much for very insightful and candid view on the Korean economy and quick survey of global economic and financial scene. With this, I'm sure there will be some questions or comments on Mr. Dallara's remark. The floor is open. Yeah. Precise.
Waiting to be recruited.
He always asks difficult questions.
Thank you.
The difficult questions is what Greg is here for. I only handle the easy ones, you know. Why else have such a good staff? Go ahead.
I have a couple of questions associated with the so-called Trans-Pacific payments imbalance, or the Chinese imbalance. First, small question. There are some signs that the U.S.-Asia global imbalances have begun to be a bit evaded relative to the GDP. Do you agree that that the imbalances problem has peaked, as it were, and you know, they are now being contained? That's one question. And another one. You emphasize the elasticity aspect of the payments adjustment, and you were optimistic that with the revaluation of the Chinese yuan, that the imbalances would lessen. But then you are well aware of the absorptionist viewpoint, perspective on that, according to which fundamental determinant of the payments imbalance or balances are the absorption involving the U.S. and China, the both sides. And unless you do something about your propensity to consume and overspending in the United States, that this so-called Trans-Pacific imbalance will continue to remain there, regardless of what you do to the exchange rates. And one more thing, forgive me for doing this. You've been emphasizing the Chinese surpluses as the major cause, but then you were not giving much, attributing much role to the Japanese continued accumulation of surpluses. In quantitative terms, I think they are more or less nearly equal to each other, and we may not be able to persuade, solve the problem unless we do something about the Japanese surpluses at the same time. So, what do you think about those questions?
Well, I think they're all three difficult questions, but I'm going to try as China will be. China, it seems to me, is a more natural partner, whereas Japan is a more natural competitor. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and certainly there is a huge market there, and I don't mean to suggest that Korean firms should not look toward it. But I think that for historical, cultural, and perhaps developmental reasons, China is, to me, a more naturally advantageous partner going forward in the near term, at least, than is Japan. With regard to investment, I do think Korea has a problem, and part of it is an image problem. This is why I made the comment I did, that I think that if Korea really wants to boost foreign investment, that it has to have both policies and rhetoric, which embrace global investors. And today there are simply too many mixed signals about foreign investors in the Korean economy. So I think it's crucial to both have a policy framework which does not raise new barriers to foreign investors, but which clearly opens the door for foreign investors, both in the financial circles and in corporate Korea. Now, I think we should recognize that there already has been a good bit of foreign investment in the financial services industry here, and I think that the recent debate maybe has obscured the fact that you do have some integration here. Yeah, if you look at some integration of foreign firms into the Korean financial services industry, and it's healthy for the Korean economy. But if you're right, if you look at the broader economic landscape here in Korea, the amount of foreign investment is still relatively modest. I do think that the most difficult thing for economies and countries to understand is when the previous growth model needs to change. Japan woke up too late. They thought their growth model of the 60s, 70s, and 80s was going to carry them into the 90s. They needed a much more flexible, much more open economy in the 90s, and they didn't realize it until it was too late. They still had their version of the chaebol, which after all was kind of the forerunner of the chaebol image. It was a keiretsu structure, and it hindered the capacity of the Japanese economy throughout the 90s to adjust to the reality, because these firms were holding shares in their other firms, and they were very reluctant to sell the shares and disengage and do their business in a competitive way, stifling entrepreneurs in Japan as a result. I think that Korea has to realize that the model going forward will need to be a mix of large and medium-sized enterprises, an environment that encourages, builds on your technological skills to encourage innovation, and that has to involve greater foreign participation in the economy, in my view. And I realize that you have a government here that is only has 8-9 months left before a new government takes over. So these are not easy things to do, but governments can send signals and they can establish direction. And I hope that the Korean government and the business community and leaders such as you with your organization can find ways to send signals in to frame policies that will encourage foreign investors in the Korean economy.
Well, with this we have to end now. Okay.
Since there is some time.
No, okay, yes, all right, sure.
When you reminded us that Korea was the second fastest growing economy among the 12 largest economies in the world, I was reminded of what was said by Jagdish Bhagwati, to the point that if you are an economist who is smart enough, you can justify any proposition. And I think you have justified the proposition that Korea is a very strong economy. On the other hand, I can justify the other kind of argument that we probably are not as strong as that, which is in the following terms. You focused on Korea's growth performance over the last 3 years. But if we look at the Korea's growth performance over the last 5 years under this administration, the average growth rate was something like 4.1 or 2. And we were one of the lowest performing economy among 12 or so East Asian economies, while Singapore has been growing at 8 or 9% per year. And so we believe that we are underperforming greatly our own growth potential. And then we do have these two main opposition party presidential contenders, both of whom argue that we can grow as fast as 7% per year during the next several years. What do you think about our growth potential? One more question. There are at least 8 cities in East Asia who are claiming to be international financial centers, and then there are some, including Seoul, who would like to become financial centers. Now, if you look at them as a whole, do you see any deleterious effect coming out of this competition to become financial centers, whether individual aspirations may or may not be realizable?
Well, I am obviously not a Korean politician, so I'm not going to talk about growth potential of 7 to 8%, but I will talk about growth potential of 5 to 6%, because I think that I travel way too much. But one of the benefits is that I see economies, all sorts of economies all over the world. Just in the last few months, I've been to North Africa, I've been to Europe, I've been to Latin America, to other parts of Asia. And I can tell you that viewed from my own, perhaps superficial, but very global perspective, sure, I picked the 3 years because the 5 years doesn't tell my story as well. If I use 5-year numbers, it's not quite as impressive as if I use 3 years. But I think the story remains a valid one, that if you look globally, this remains an extremely strong, competitive, dynamic economy. Last year, I was in Latin America for the program we organized with around the edges of the Inter-American Development Bank. And your former the Vice Minister, Christy Kwan, Tai-Chi Kwan, who is now in Paris enjoying some good cuisine in the OECD, he gave a speech about the keys to Korean success. Everyone in the room was either a Latin official or a Latin banker, and you could hear a pin drop. You could hear a pin drop, because all of Latin America, virtually all of Latin America, perhaps with a few exceptions, is struggling to find some of the keys to success that Korea has found. I've been in the Middle East recently. These are very distorted and strange economies. They just run on oil. They have, you mentioned this issue of a dynamic economy with a control mentality, and it's a good example. But I don't approve at all. Korea is still struggling. The government in Korea is still struggling to understand that it should be a partner of business, not a controller of business. But let's face it, it's a legacy that you have to grow out of. But in so many other parts of the world, business and government are so intertwined that you cannot get efficient, balanced growth. So I think that if you view things globally, you may see Korea in a somewhat more benign, positive perspective, notwithstanding the shortcomings. Yes, I realize that many of you may feel that this current government has not always had the perfect set of economic policies, but if you flexibilize the economy further, economies can be, with all respect, partly immunized from political leadership. That's what's happened to the U.S. economy to a certain extent. Of course, eventually, bad economic policies come home to roost, but you don't have the fiscal problems we do. You don't have the current account problems we do. We do have a wonderful economy in the U.S., but we've got some serious problems which require government intervention. But I stand by my final judgment that, if you look at it in a global perspective, this remains a very strong and dynamic economy, but not yet as flexible and not yet as connected into the world economy as it used to be.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dallara is biased and he is pro-Korean anyway, pro-Korea, because his daughter is Korean born and she's really, seriously, I think if you compare Korea with other emerging economies and other economies in the world, we are doing okay. However, people here in Korea, and particularly in the intellectual community, see Korean economy with some not really the satisfactory way, because we can do better than what we invested in. And I think, as you said, even growth potential can be substantially raised. But if we do, as just you said, we make the system more flexible and introduce more competition and we open our economy and so forth, then we can increase the growth potential and particularly flexibility and so forth. So I suppose people, if you talk to many Korean intellectuals, you always find that you hear many complaints. Because the reason is, I think they agree. We know we can do better. That's why I think on a global standard we're doing well. But in any case, I really appreciate very much. Charles took a very busy schedule out for this lecture and gave us a very frank and candid view on the Korean economy. Some encouraging, and also he gave us some advices which will be helpful for Korean policy. So we appreciate very much, and we'll have you back in the near future. Thank you very much.